Welcome to this session on Pump Up Your Pop-ups with Arcade. I'm Beth Romero, a product engineer on the ArcGIS Online team, focusing mostly on configurable apps, and I'm joined with Paul Barker, also a product engineer who works with the Arcade team. So we'll talk about pop-ups today. We'll show you some ways to transform them from the default list of attributes, specifically how to improve them with Arcade, and then how they are an extremely valuable asset in web applications. Pop-ups are configured within the web map and exposed throughout Esri's online platform. Web apps, such as configurable apps, often showcase map content, and that includes pop-ups. Authoring web apps can be really easy, but taking a little bit of extra time and thought to craft a well-thought-out pop-up can be well worth your time. Pop-ups are like windows of information, and they're there to tell your app users something important about your map. Improving on the default pop-up can really be as easy as adding a title and a custom attribute display to show attribute values in a meaningful sentence. Colors can be added to help style your pop-up. This can be done directly in the map's pop-up configuration or with Arcade. If you want to accomplish something that cannot be done through the map's pop-up configuration, then it might be time to see what Arcade is all about. Arcade is a lightweight scripting language. Arcade expressions can do a number of tasks from calculating attributes on the fly, creating conditional statements, and even making layers talk to each other through feature sets. It's standardized across the ArcGIS On platform. So what that means is expressions written in Pro will work in Online, and those translate into apps. Basically, it's letting you derive new information on the fly, format information, so for example with colors. Paul will dig a lot deeper into the cool things you can do with Arcade shortly. So we're going to work a little backwards today and show you some great examples of pop-ups in apps and why taking the time to configure them can add so much value. So once you've taken the time to create a meaningful pop-up, you can publish your map to an app. Pop-ups in the map will persist to the app. Configurable apps are a collection of purpose-based apps, oftentimes highlighting the map with added functionality to serve the purpose of the application. They are quick and easy to configure and publish. The apps released over the past year are referred to as instant apps, and they provide a clean experience to publish your map to a functioning application really quickly. These apps are responsive, working on a variety of devices. Our team has also been focused on improving the accessibility of apps over the past year. So let's take a look at some examples of thoughtfully created pop-ups in different configurable apps. So here I have a map showing historical plaques in Ireland. This data was collected from an open data site where the attributes aren't always formatted that great and maybe some information is missing. This is where taking the time to configure your pop-up can really add a lot of value to your map and application. I'd like to create a configurable app which will let people explore the historical plaques in Ireland. One of the most important features in the map that I want to highlight is the pop-up, which contains the information about the plaque dedication. First, let's take a look at the default pop-up. So we'll go ahead and open up one of the features and take a look at the pop-up. You'll see right now it's just in the default table of attributes. I'm going to come over here, click Configure Pop-up, and I'm going to add a variety of content to start. First thing I'm going to do is add some text. I'd really like to focus on the inscription here. So I'm going to add the inscription field in. Okay. And that's all I'm going to put in for that component. The next content I'd like to add is an image. There's actually two images I'm going to use in this, but the first one, is from a field, and we'll grab that. I'm also going to remove the field, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. Now let's take a look at the pop-up. Already it's gotten so much better. All right, we're going to keep working on it. And then next I'm going to take advantage of some links out to Wikipedia and DBpedia. And I'm going to use an expression for this because not every feature has this field populated. So let's go to Manage Expressions. I already have one in here for Wikipedia. Open it up. And it's a conditional statement, so if it's empty, it won't show. This looks good. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And I'm going to add one more expression. Copy this in here. I'm going to give it a name. test it. All right, and click OK. Now that I have my two expressions, I need to add them into the pop-up. So I'm going to add, text. And in here, I can access my expressions by adding a field. I'm going to scroll to the bottom, and the first one I'm going to add is Wikipedia. And I want these to be centered. Oops, centered. Go ahead, and I'm going to add the next one. All right. And I also want these to be links. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to add a link, and I'm going to use a field value. For this one. Great, and I'm going to do the same thing for the next one. And these fields contain links out to the specific plaque Wikipedia site. Okay, let's take a look at the pop-up now. Now I can see I can find out more about the specific plaque, both to the Wikipedia and the DBpedia site. And the last thing I'd like to add to this is one more image. And in here, I'm going to search for the photograph. I'm going to go ahead and find that field. Here's the image I'm looking for. All right, and now you can see I have the two images added. I have two texts, and I can mix them between each other. All right, so I have this looking the way I'd like. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save it. And I'm going to go to the actual item itself and make sure that I have a full description in here, because configurable apps can also showcase description information. So I'm going to create a web app. And I'm going to look specifically for minimalist. And now it's going to open the configuration portion of this template. And this is opening up the configuration panel, and by default, the configuration panel opens to the Express setup. The Express setup is 4 steps, and it's showing really just the essential settings in every configuration app. This app called Minimalist is a really nice way to highlight great pop-up information and any details about the map. So I already have my map selected. I'm going to go to About. And in here, I'm going to enable which panels I'd like to be open. So I'm going to select the pop-up panel. And I'm going to select Details to be open by default. So it shows all the information about the map. Now when I click on a pop-up, you'll see the information in the side panel. And you'll also notice if the feature does not contain links to those Wikipedia and DBpedia sites, they are just not shown. All right, I can continue to go through here and select any types of interactivity tools I would like, and then finally I can customize the theme. So I'm going to turn off shared theme. I can decide between light or dark. And a nice feature of configurable apps is that you can also move around any of the map components you'd like. So if I move the home button and the zoom control, I can move them all over to the right-hand side. It's just really easy to drag and drop in between. Once I have my application looking the way I'd like, I'm going to go ahead and publish it. All my changes are saved by default in this draft mode, and then once it's published, that's saved, and if I continue to make changes, then you would see those reflected in a new draft mode. All right, so let's take a look at the published application. And here is the completed version of the Minimalist application. And again, it's opening up to the details, which is what we selected. And when I click on a pop-up, it's going to display that information in the side panel. And the Minimalist application is great for showing multi-element pop-ups. So in here, we have text and we have an attachment, and we're also using an arcade expression. Let's show one more configurable app that relies heavily on the pop-up. This is the Nearby app. The purpose of this application is to return all the features within a specified distance of a searched location. So for this example, the map is showing different COVID testing sites, and I can search the map. So let's just try this out. So I'm going to search the map by just clicking anywhere in the map, and it's going to return all the testing sites within 5 miles of that search location. I can change that by toggling this nice slider and increase my search distance or decrease it. In this panel, you will see the pop-up information being returned for each feature. So as I scroll through, it's going to show me where that feature is located on the map. It's also going to show me how far it is from my searched location. In addition, you can tell that this pop-up has definitely been configured. It has had some styling applied to it where the part of the pop-up information matches the symbolization of the feature. It's also showing me other valuable information in a readable format. I can see what type of test it is, the hours, and I can also access the website to make an appointment. Nearby relies heavily on the pop-up information as that's the primary information that's being shown in the panel. You will also see that the app setup looks similar to the previous one we were looking at. And I'm going to switch to the full setup. This is going to give me access to all of the app settings. So in here I can see I have quite a bit more options, and if I just want to search for something specific, I'm going to look to append directions to the results returned. I'm going to enable this on, and now let's clear our search and complete another search by clicking on the map. And this time I can see as I scroll down, I'm going to have the option to show directions. Now, if this app did not have the pop-up configured with valuable information, it would not be as useful. So I'm going to turn it over to Paul, where he's going to talk a little bit more about this map and how to configure the pop-up for this example.
Thanks, Beth, for that great overview. So let's dive into a specific example. So I've got the map open here in the Map Viewer Classic for the testing site's location. And as we saw previously, it's got a really dynamic pop-up with lots of information. And many of those kind of information pieces are kind of configured and set up via Arcade. So if we come into the pop-up, we'll see that we're using a custom attribute display. I can hit configure, and that gives me an overview of what is being used in the pop-up. So we can see here that, similar to fields, we reference expressions with the squiggly brackets, expression and the expression number. You can take a look here and see which expression you want to insert, just like any other field. And we pull in the expression name there to make it a little bit easier to insert and know what you're doing. Because as you start getting a ton of these expressions, it can be really difficult to discern them. So let's dive in and take a look at stipulations. So stipulations is inserted at the top of the pop-up there, and it's really all of the things that you need to be aware of prior to going to this testing site. So do you need a referral? Is an appointment required? Does it support drive-through? Should you call ahead? Does it also offer the vaccination? So these are what's really going on here. This looks like a long expression. It's really not that complicated when you break it down. So it's a series of if statements. And what we're doing is building up a single string or piece of text that lists all of the requirements, and they're separating each one by a semicolon. So if we hit test right now, the Arcade editor, which is this window here, is populated with a set of test data. So we can typically run the expression in the editor, look at what the results are, and then make sure that we're on track. So right now, for this particular dummy feature, no referral is required. You do need an appointment, and they do not support drive-through testing. So, so it's basically each one of these is a different condition. You'll see $ feature and then a field name in brackets here. And so you'll see kind of two ways to represent Arcade fields when you're working with $feature. You'll see the dot notation, which is $feature dot field name, or you'll see the square bracket notation. They are largely equivalent, and The only time you really need to use the bracket notation is if you've got underscores or spaces and things like that. It's just a better pattern to use. So the dot notation does not work with spaces and things like that. So that's the only difference. You'll see it kind of change depending on the field itself in its actual field name. So just be aware. It trips people up at the start. They don't know which one to use. That's the rules kind of for which one to use. And by and large, if your data has no spaces, you can just happily use the dot notation. All right, so let's take a look. So where that comes in to play in the pop-up is right here, as we saw earlier. So in this particular feature, appointments required to call first. That's all being driven by the arcade expression. All right, let's take a look at status color. So let's dive in. So status color is actually doing something really clever and interesting here. So what we're doing is looking at the value in $feature.status, so the feature that you clicked on, and we are returning a hex color code based on the value. So this is essentially a mapping of the status to a color code. And how that gets used essentially creates this conditional color scenario. So it's kind of hard to see here because it's actually used inside of the HTML itself. So what it's doing is returning a color based on the status to drive this green. And so I think if we clicked on a red, it's discontinued. So essentially it's conditional color driven by your attributes. And so today you kind of have to do this through this manual HTML editing. This is something we do want to make a little bit easier in the future. So we're experimenting with different ways within Arcade on how we can solve problems like this, but also give you a little bit more control as well. So just look for that in the future. So there's a handful of expressions. Let's look at just a couple more. So what's something interesting in this pop-up that we could look at? So I'm going to go, let's go into this one. So let's look at the services offered and the municipality. So let's hit test just to get a lay of the land. So this tells you that it's COVID testing only and no screening, and it's in Fort Collins. So basically, if you look at this expression, the real key piece here that's heavily used is empty. So is empty is a way to check whether or not a value is null or an empty string. So this is quite handy. In Arcade, you do need to handle empty states yourself. So if your data has null values, it's best to check for those. If you know that your data set isn't going to have null values, you can obviously simplify your expression a little bit, but I think most data has that potential. So it's always a good practice to check a value. So all it's doing is saying, hey, if the municipality is not empty, and then if the services offered is not empty, then concatenate those two together. Otherwise, just return the municipality. Otherwise, don't return anything. So these are two different cases, basically. So as you can see here, here's the string. We hit this condition basically up here. And that's why we're seeing it. So this is COVID testing only. And if we went into services offsite and looked at the test feature here, there we go. And take a look at this. So one more thing to call out here. This is using a domain, and you'll see that in here we use the function domain name. And by default, obviously, if you return the value of a given field, it's not going to have the domain name in it. So this is why we're using the function here. Is the domain code is what will always get returned by default when you return just $feature field name. What we really want is a cleaner piece of text, which is typically the name in the domain case. So what we're doing is saying, hey, grab the domain name, don't just use the code, and that ultimately creates a better experience in the pop-up for users. And so that's really, I think, a good overview of what these expressions are doing. Most of the other ones here are very similar variants. They're leveraging the same techniques. They're not crazy complicated, but they do ultimately allow you to create this really dynamic, complex pop-up at the end of the day, just by manipulating your own data. So with that, let me flip back over to our slides and just talk really quick about some resources. So there's a URL here that kind of has up-to-date links for all of these things that I'm going to talk about. There's a number of places you can go. By and large, the first place to go is the blogs. There's lots of blogs out there. Some of them I've written myself. Many of them are written by fellow product engineer Lisa Berry on the Living Atlas team, and Christian on the JavaScript API team. So there's a lot of really great practical examples in the blogs. We have some story maps as well that just talk you through kind of some of the basics that we've showed here today with another example. As always, we've got the developers site, developers.arcgis.com, has tons of documentation about how the functions, particularly when you get into the geometry functions. It's nice to have that resource. It also helps you kind of understand some of the nitty gritty in Arcade about variable scope, all of the different flow logics supported. We do have a GitHub site where we've been posting some interesting examples of Arcade over the years. And one thing I'll say about this is we do want to improve this. So, we've been doing the GitHub thing for a little while. I think what we would like to do in future updates to ArcGIS Online is give you kind of a better way to save and share and reuse Arcade expressions within your own content in your organization. There's often times where it would be really nice to be able to store the function once in a separate place and then reference it many times across maps so that you're only updating the script once in one place and not having to remember which maps use that expression when you make improvements over time. We've also got a group here in ArcGIS Online where we've showcased some of the more interesting examples, uses of Arcade. So I don't have a dedicated slide, but I just wanted to talk a little bit too about what's next. So we are doing a lot of work in Arcade. One of the big projects that we're working on throughout 2021 is a redesign and a update to the Arcade editor, so the place where you write your expression. We've been compiling feedback for a while now, and kind of starting to hone in on that rewrite so that we can get you guys the updates that you need and that you've been asking for. So look forward to a whole new revamp of that. Some of the, while it's still very much under active development, some of the themes that we're really striving for is to make it easier to explore your data while you're writing expressions. We recognize that, not having access to the data itself when you're writing the expression means that you're hopping in and out of the Arcade editor quite a bit to look at your data, or you're opening that data in another tab to kind of look up values. And so we want to keep that data close to the Arcade editing experience so that as you're compiling that script, you can explore your data. You can ask those questions right there of your data and then update your script accordingly. So yeah, that's what's coming down the pipe. We're also doing some work in the pop-up specifically to try and make it easier to do some of the things that you saw today. So you saw today that, to achieve that pop-up, it took 15 Arcade expressions for the COVID testing location. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of expressions for you guys as users to manage. We want to find a better pattern for doing more in a single expression so that you can compose more of the pop-up with fewer expressions. And those of you familiar with the dashboard beta that's going on right now, I would look to see, some of the patterns there are probably going to find their way similarly to the pop-up to give you a little more freedom. One of the bonuses there is that it'll also allow you to write more efficient arcade expressions. So rather than having to repeat the same query over multiple expressions to do very similar related things, you'll be able to send that once. And while that's a little geeky, what it really is going to do is it's going to make your pop-up work faster, and it'll give a better experience for your end users. And so with that, I want to say thank you for listening, and please take the time to fill out the survey below. And if you've got questions specifically about anything we've shown here today, come find Beth and I at the showcase, and we're happy to answer your questions and looking forward to hearing them. Thanks.